Hello, Cedar Village. I am very excited for another weekly Village Torah portion discussion. And this week's Torah portion is Mishpatim. Now, this translates to, I think people usually translate statutes, translate Mishpatim as statutes. Now, this is following on the heels, just for some context. We are still in the book of Exodus. And what we started off in the book of Exodus was the Israelites, the Jewish people, being in Egypt, and then having the Egyptians were really concerned about the people, the Israelites. They really, as the Pharaoh describes it, as almost like a fifth column that could be a threat from within. And so they decide to enslave them. They decide to throw the baby boys, kill them. And the Israelites were in a really bad place. They had crushing hard labor with which they had to deal. And ultimately, through God using Moses and his leadership and the plagues, eventually the Israelites are able to get out of Egypt. And then, as we saw a couple of Torah portions ago, they were dealing with just merely surviving, not only escaping the Egyptian armies, but getting through the Red Sea, and then dealing with hunger and thirst, and then at the very tail end of 2 weeks ago's Torah portion, also having to deal with the Amalekites threatening them and attacking them. 2 weeks ago, we had that, which was all about the need to survive. Last week's Torah portion, Yitro, was the need to thrive. So we went from survive to thrive. And that starts off, we have Yitro, the father-in-law of Moses. They meet, they have conversation. Yitro dispenses good advice about delegation. But then we go into perhaps the most significant event of the entirety of the Torah, which is the revelation at Mount Sinai of the various mitzvot, of the various commandments, starting with the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments. That was last week's Torah portion. And that's sort of where we finish off as we roll into this week's Torah portion. So that's some context for us. What we have here is, yes, we get these 10 statements, we can call them 10 Commandments. It's funny because we do see them in the Torah described as Aseret HaDibrot, 10 statements. So not the 10 Commandments, as it's often translated into English, but the 10 statements, because the very first of these statements was, I am the Lord your God, which really isn't so much of a command, go and do this. It's a statement. It just is. So we have here, what we have in last week's Torah portion is an interesting mix of this opening 10 commandments, these opening 10 statements, as it were, a mixture. Some that I think we would describe more in the realm of religion or God-related stuff. We have not bowing down to idols. We have observe the Sabbath. But we also have things that I think we would generally say are more universally applicable. Don't murder, don't steal. And we have, which I don't think are necessarily particular to the Jewish people, to the Israelites. And that leads, and it's interesting because at the end of just as a little bit of a context, as we saw there, the Israelites protested and said, this is too much to bear. This is too much for us. If we continue having this sort of revelation from God, we're not going to be able to stand. It's just too much for us to bear. Moses, we're delegating this to you. You go up, you get this from God. We'll sit back and you can share it with us. And that's what we see in this week's Torah portion, that this is what God is giving to Moses, a bunch of more commandments, more mitzvot. I think if one were to count them up, because there are a lot, over 50, there are definitely dozens of mitzvot, definitely dozens of commandments in here, more than 4 dozen of which are really interesting. Although, as we see, and if anybody wants to keep score at home, wants to read on their own, we are in chapters. It starts off with chapter 21. Is that right? Yep. Starts off with chapter 21, and we have a bunch of commandments which don't necessarily read as necessarily religious per se. And then we have chapter 22, which again, mostly not particularly religious per se. And then a little bit at the end. And then chapter 23, it starts to, again, it has some more universal and then gets into the more particularistic. And then we have chapter 24, which is more narrative oriented. Now, what I find really fascinating, and scholars have pointed this out, what we have in Parashat Mishpatim in this week's Torah portion, there are a high degree of similarities of these commandments that are, I mentioned, universalistic. They are of what happens when someone else's ox scores your ox, or what if you find someone's donkey laying around? What if a fire is started and spreads to thorns? What if there's a thief who goes into someone's house? These aren't things one would normally associate with something, at least in our current cultural context. Someone wouldn't necessarily associate these as being religious per se, but as scholars have pointed out, these bear strong resemblances to what we read of in the Code of Hammurabi. So that's I think a Babylonian or Mesopotamian code of law, which is thousands of years old. And there are a lot of similarities. Whether they copied and pasted them or laid over more of an Israelite angle over it, unclear, but certainly a lot of these things, for really any society, it's more than just a religion. It's also building a civil society for our people. What things need to be, what parameters, what things need to be in place, what parameters of a civil society, respecting the property of others, very important. What we have a bunch of things involving animals. What if it's stolen? What if it was torn? We also have what if a man seduces a virgin, or some interesting things. We also have a really fascinating commandment in chapter 22, verse 17. You shall not allow a witch to live, not allowing a sorceress to live. But we also, several verses later, verse 21, in verse 20, you shall not wrong a stranger nor oppress that stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Verse 21, you shall not ill-treat any widow nor orphan. 22, if you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me. We also have 24, and this is, again, chapter 22, verse 24. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor. Exact no interest from them. So we have a variety of things, a variety of commandments that aren't restricted to the realm of religion per se. It's something broader. It's something that is working towards the development and building up of society. There's so much to study in these. I'll just share a personal story. So I mentioned what that verse, which consists of literally 3 words, Mechashefa lo techaya, you shall not allow a sorceress or a witch to remain living. Back in rabbinical school, I did an entire class, a whole session on the interpretation of just this one verse, of just these 3 words, and the various rabbinic interpretation thereof throughout the generations, through not only rabbinic literature, but even a medieval period and beyond. So it's and witches and sorcery are a really fascinating topic, and that's just one verse within this week's Torah portion. One could probably spend just so much time focusing literally just on this week's Torah portion. That's one of the, yes, last week's Torah portion, Yitro, gets a lot of play, gets a lot of attention, because it has this outset, this beginning, this kicking off of the revelation at Sinai from God of all these different commandments, these mitzvot. But this week's Torah portion, and I'm not trying to downplay last week's Torah portion and the 10 statements, the Decalogue, but this week is chock full of a lot. There's so much, and so much that people could delve into and go on which is not the place of this this session. That having been said, we do get, curiously, in Exodus 23, from verses 14 and on, we get some certain festivals that we are supposed to celebrate. So there's a lot of really interesting. It's actually, you know what? I'm just going to share it because it really, I want to say, summarizes them. It puts them together. You shall observe the fest of unleavened bread. That's Passover, eating unleavened bread for 7 days, as I have commanded you at the set time in the month of Aviv. For in it you went forth from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty-handed. In the feast of the harvest, of the first fruits of your work, of what you sow in the field, and the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you gather in the results of your work from the field. 3 times a year, all your men, your males, shall appear before the sovereign, the Lord. What's interesting about this is we have in Leviticus chapter 23, we have an expansion, what's going on with all these different festivals, but here it's more compact. It's almost more easily to memorize or to otherwise, refer back to it, and it's easier to remember. We do also have a bunch of numbers. I just mentioned that. This is still chapter 23. We have those 3 festivals. We also have in verse 10, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. This is really neat. It says, let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves. And the 6 and 7 piece is not restricted to one's gathering of one's crops, but also 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall cease from labor, in order that your ox and your donkey may rest, and your bondman and the stranger may be refreshed. So it's an interesting play around with these numbers, the 3 festivals. We have the 6 days of working and the 7th of resting, the 6 days of working your land and the 7th of resting. We have these numbers, and it's really, I'm just going to call it, it's a potpourri. It's a bonanza. It's a cornucopia of mitzvot. A lot of fascinating things to explore in this week's Torah portion. Really neat. So much to explore. One little thing I do want to point out, I don't know how well known it is, which is, and it comes across in this context that isn't actually that, I don't know how much people really think about it, but has to do with what happens when people are fighting. So here it is. It's in chapter 21, verse 22. So here it is. When men fight, I guess men commonly fight, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman. Now, I don't know how often a pregnant woman is around a fight, but again, it can happen. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning. Now, this comes across as really simply a verse about damages, right? And actually, that's the broader context of what's going on. If one sees the subsequent verses, it's about damages, of physical damages one causes to other people. And certainly even the previous verses, it's also about physical damage and monetary payment, monetary restitution, basically. What's really fascinating is this verse single-handedly is pointed to by both the rabbinic tradition, as well as not just the rabbinic tradition, the Jewish tradition, but even also, curiously, the Christian tradition, in understanding what is the status of a fetus. What is the status of a fetus? And so when this pregnant woman who loses this pregnancy, the word here is ason. It's aleph, samech, vav, nun, sofit, ason. So what happens? So how does one understand this translation? In rabbinic tradition, it's a fetus, it's a miscarriage, and this directly informs abortion. And so the way that abortion or otherwise terminating a pregnancy, a human pregnancy, is understood as it's not really a person, but it's not really not a person, right? It's some sort of quasi in between status. It's not a person. And so in Jewish tradition, when it comes to termination of pregnancies, that there are a lot of factors. I'm not trying to simplify. Let me just say this. It is a complicated topic, but for our purposes now, a common thing is, what happens if a pregnant woman's life is endangered by giving birth? Well, her life takes precedence over this fetus's life because it's not a full life, and that comes out of this particular verse. Whereas I believe, and I could be wrong, but I think in the Christian tradition they understand this word to be different, which is understand it as a life unto itself, even though it may not be necessarily viable outside of the womb at the time. So this verse, which really is just about monetary restitution and with physical damage, yet it bears broader consequences beyond, which even plays into politics of today, which is really fascinating as we see play out. So this week's Torah portion, and I didn't even touch, by the way, you can feel free to read on your own, which is really fascinating about chapter 24. So chapters 21, 22, 23, a lot of legislation, a lot of commandments, a lot of mitzvot, a lot to unpack. Really exciting. Each verse on its own, there's so much there. It's so rich, so dense. It's very exciting. I will say, chapter 24, for those of you who don't really care for the legislative aspects, the collection of commandments in those three chapters, chapter 24 is narrative. For those interested in narrative, you have Moses. God says to Moses, "Come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel, and then bow low from afar." So there's an interesting story that ultimately ends, which is really strange. I'm not even sure how to understand it. I'm still working through it. That this is really interesting. Here we go. Okay, so in verses 9 through 11 in chapter 24, this is really interesting, and I'm pretty sure most people, you may have read it, you may have heard it. I don't know how many people actually think about it. I'm deeply fascinated by it, and if anybody has any ideas on it, I'd love to hear it. Moses and Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, and 70 elders of Israel ascended, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was the likeness of a pavement of sapphire, like the very sky of purity. Okay, I'm not exactly sure how that appears, but it sounds beautiful. It sounds absolutely gorgeous. And here we go with verse 11. Yet God did not raise his hand against the leaders of the Israelites. They saw God, or they beheld him, and they ate and they drank. And this is just such a fascinating scene to imagine. How does that work? Like, I mean, I don't know what it means to see God, what that means. I don't know why necessarily the reaction would then to eat and drink, to basically have a banquet when seeing God. But it sounds like it was a very special occasion, that's for sure. So this Torah portion is a really interesting one. Certainly not a typical one. I wouldn't say not typical, but it's an interesting blend of three chapters that are chock full of commandments, a lot to unpack, and then that final chapter in which we have this. It's not just Moses seeing God; it's Moses, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, and 70 elders. So it's an interesting Torah portion. If anybody wants to check it, if anybody would like to check it out, verses chapters 21 through 24 of Exodus. So I hope this was a helpful overview of what's going on in this interesting Torah portion this week. I'm certainly fascinated by it. It certainly has a lot of fodder to consider. I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.